Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Mario. Those names are mentioned in every Galaxy video, so I'm mentioning them too. I always love the dramatic tone shifts whenever Galaxy comes up. Almost makes you forget that you're playing a game about Mr. Wahoo and Let's-a Go. Although in fairness, Mario Galaxy has a drastic tone shift compared to what came before, which is incredible considering what we felt in Peach's Castle and all that we accomplished in Delfino Plaza. But Mario Galaxy hits different. So obviously, the perspective here might shift a bit depending on how old you are. But I was a couple years into high school by the time the Wii was coming out, following the launch in online forums and keeping up with all the news. Up until now, I don't know if I've ever been as hyped for anything as I was during the Wii era. Now obviously, a lot of that was due to Smash Bros. Brawl and the Dojo website that updated daily, but even leading up to the console, the Nintendo Revolution and the name change to the Wii and all of that stuff, man, I still can't believe how good that console did. And it's a good thing it's as successful as it was because Mario Galaxy 1 deserved to be on a successful console. Now, I'm not going to sit here and try and argue that Mario Galaxy is only as fondly remembered as it was because it was on the most successful Nintendo console at the time. I think there was clear quality control improvements going from Sunshine to Galaxy. But I think anybody would be naive to assume that if the Nintendo Wii was a failure like the Wii U, for example, Galaxy might not be as loved as it is today. And we probably never would have gotten Galaxy 2. And in this hypothetical scenario, maybe critics would have laughed at Nintendo for putting Mario in outer space. The point is, the Wii was phenomenal, and Mario Galaxy was phenomenal. I was so hyped for this game. I was hyped for the Wii, I was hyped for the Wiimote, the nunchuck, all of it. All of my friends were waiting for their PS3s or were already content with their Xbox 360s. I had a 360 myself, but I knew that I was going to be doing nothing but playing Wii for the next while. One of my fondest, and quite frankly dumbest memories is holding a Nintendo 64 controller and a TV remote in my right hand, because I wanted to get a feel for how the Wiimote and nunchuck could work prior to the release of the console. I was convinced that the nunchuck was the middle prong of the Nintendo 64 controller, and I still am. Why wouldn't it be? The middle prong was where you put your left hand after all. Unless you were one of those wide grip Nintendo 64 users, in which case I have nothing more to say to you. Anyway, there's plenty of time for me to oogle about the Wii later. Right now it's about Mario Galaxy. So, first of all, hello and welcome. Most of you that have been following along know that I've already covered Mario 64, Mario 64 DS, and Super Mario Sunshine. But since I'm obsessed with 3D Mario, I like to talk about every aspect of these games. Or at least most of them. Which is why instead of making a single video, I opt to go for the series and create a playlist. Now obviously this is part 1 of my Mario Galaxy retrospective. I'm not sure exactly which number I'm going to stop at, but on my last count, I think it's going to be about 22 segments. So clear your lunch schedule for the next 3 weeks because I'll be uploading every day at 11 AM Eastern Time. And of course, at any point in time, you can get early access to videos if you join my Patreon or become a YouTube channel member. This will, for the most part, run similar to my previous 3D Mario retrospectives. Not including today's video, there should be 15 videos on all of the grand galaxies in the game. Another 2 videos on the small galaxies, 1 on the purple coins, 1 on the Comet Observatory and the general story and lore of the game, 1 on the Bowser fights, and a conclusion. Obviously, this is all subject to change because I am working on this as I go through the game, but that's the general layout I have in mind at the moment. In any case, my experience with Galaxy mostly comes from how much I played it after it came out on the Wii. I can't really count how many times I went start to end on it, but I know I spent a few years where I would revisit it at least twice a year. At some point in the mid-2010s, I stopped playing Wii altogether, and there was a long hiatus up until the game came out with 3D All-Stars. Which, by the way, is the version I'm currently playing. I largely debated playing this on the Wii because I wanted to do the Wiimote and nunchuck thing, but I also wanted you guys to have the best footage possible. I probably could have messed around with certain settings to make it look good while still using the Wiimote and nunchuck, but I also kind of wanted it to be authentic. So I just figured, you know what, I'll just do it on the Switch, and I'll just do Galaxy 2 on the Wii. since that one, for whatever reason, has not been ported over to the Switch. Anyway, when 3D All-Stars came out, there were a few things I noticed. First, I played the game entirely handheld. I didn't want to give the Joy-Cons a chance because I had no faith in them being anywhere near as good as the Wiimote Nunchuk combo. I didn't mind the touchscreen as much. It was definitely inferior, but it wasn't that bad. This time around, I used the Joy-Cons. And I gotta say, I was pleasantly surprised at how good it felt. And I actually think I prefer it to the Wiimote Nunchuk. Now, nothing will ever be as accurate as the pointer was. You'll be spending all game recentering that cursor. But the funny thing is, it wasn't while I was holding the Joy-Cons separately that I enjoyed it. It was when I threw them both in the Joy-Con grip that I actually started to feel like this control was an improvement. I'm assuming this is the same way that the Pro Controller would feel, but I stuck with the Joy-Cons because I knew there would be some challenges where it would be easier to just use a single Joy-Con. But throughout the general flow of the game, it felt so natural. I was actually shocked because it didn't feel natural when I played it handheld and used the touchscreen. Now granted, I'm assuming anybody that's used motion controls for aiming already knows this is great, but I haven't really got into Splatoon, so I had no idea. That being said, really the only reason I'm saying I might prefer this control to the Wiimote and Nunchuk is primarily because I don't have to fight the Wiimote to aim at the sensor bar properly. I don't think mine's faulty, they work like 95% of the time, but there's always that 5%. Plus, sometimes it's chilly when I'm playing and I like to be cuddled up in a blanket and keep my hands under the blanket for warmth. The Wiimote and Nunchuk combo makes that very difficult. Another thing that really stuck out to me, and even concerned me about Mario Galaxy when I first played on 3D All-Stars, was that I was playing it after going through Mario 64 and Mario Sunshine. I'm not trying to turn this into a hate fest, I'm not trying to rewrite history. I don't want anybody's takeaway to be that I think that Mario Galaxy is not a good game. But I will say, nothing will make Galaxy feel more tame as a video game than playing it after Sunshine. When I was playing Sunshine, I had my sleeves rolled up. I could barely pay attention to whatever podcast I had playing in the background, because I was too busy slamming my head into the wall. The stark drop in difficulty when playing a flagship Mario title for the hardcore gamer, and then shifting over to a flagship Mario title for the casual gamer, is so noticeable here. Maybe it was noticeable back then too, but way back in the day, the technological advancements of Galaxy alone papered over the cracks. I'm not even sure if I should be calling these cracks because I don't know if the difficulty is necessarily a bad thing. I'm just saying that Galaxy really could afford to have some secret area shines knock you on your butt for 20 minutes every now and then. Especially because the technological accomplishments of Galaxy are not as impressive as they were back in the day. Don't get me wrong, the gravity gimmick is still phenomenal, the game controls great, it's beautiful really. The music will light up your heart. But the game did come out in 2007. When I play it now, I'm a little less impressed by the spectacle of the game, even if I'm still enjoying it. But that feeling of being alone in outer space, that sense of accomplishment you get from making a long jump around the galaxy, or the fun way you experiment with collecting starbits and shooting them at different enemies. I'm not wowed by this anymore, which is fine. I don't think a game should be punished because somebody playing it decades later is saying they're not wowed by the technical aspect of it anymore. But it's just a reality. My reality. Instead, some things that stuck out to me that I never noticed before was how floaty everything was, how slow the movement was, how annoyingly easy everything was, and perhaps worst of all, how much I actually enjoyed the dive over the long jump. I think I've always been more about the long jump over the dive until recently, so it never bothered me before. But man, did I want the dive in this game when I was going through it. Now that being said, I am not trying to make this a negative perspective. I think it's important to point out flaws in video games, but it's even more important to enjoy video games. And I promise you I would have not gone for 120 stars if I was not having an excellent time with it. But these were just the things that stuck out to me initially. And I say initially because I think as the game went on, and I started finally losing a few lives, the game got significantly more enjoyable for me. It's just unfortunate that it took so long to get to that point. But it also took as long as it did because I was adamant about completing every star in every galaxy before moving forward, or at least as much as the game would allow me to. If I was playing this normally and just moving through the galaxies and heading to the final galaxy, I can fully accept that I would have made it there sooner, so I might have felt the difficulty spike a lot earlier. And likewise, I might not have repeated comet challenges almost immediately after completing the star that they were based off of, so it might have been a little bit harder. But that's just a reality of these games that allow you to jump around. The difficulty curve is dynamic and depends on your approach to the title. Aside from that, I think the only other complaint that I might have had was that the camera was not as good as I remembered it being, but it also wasn't that big of a nuisance because the game does a pretty good job guiding you without making you rely on moving the camera on your own. Also, the camera is miles better than the games that came before, and I think that's what matters the most. Now, speaking of the games that came before, I think Mario Galaxy has always struggled with a bit of an identity crisis. When it was first announced, Reggie Fils-Aimé famously referred to it as the true sequel to Mario 64, basically claiming that Sunshine was not a sequel to Mario 64, although to be fair, the only reason they did that was because the GameCube undersold. But I remember talking points around Mario not having FLUDD, being able to long jump again, being able to finish the game without having to go through every single star in the primary stages. Those were all true aspects of the game, and it's what they were trying to sell us on to convince us that this was Mario in outer space directly after saving Princess Peach in Mario 64. Heck, even the castle grounds in the introduction were made to look like they were from Mario 64. Obviously, at some point people realized that this game was not an open sandbox Mario game, and in actuality had less in common with Sunshine than Mario 64 did. Which is why when Super Mario Odyssey was announced, and they put the 3D Mario titles into two different categories, the very same company that claimed that Mario Galaxy was the true sequel to Mario 64 placed it in line with the linear games, and instead grouped Sunshine with 64. Identity crisis. Now, I actually think the fundamentals of Galaxy has a lot more in common with 64, and Sunshine for that matter, than many people would think. It's pretty clear to me that from the beginning, Nintendo was trying to find a way to create the same type of linear levels that the 2D games had and translate them into 3D. This would eventually culminate in what we know now as 3D World. But there were strides made along the way. While yes, Mario 64 was a collectathon, many courses and star objectives in that title had a very direct path that it expected you to take. It wasn't always successful, but a lot of times you knew you were just meant to follow the main path, and that would usually take you to the first or second star. This is part of the reason why you would often get kicked out of the stage. You had completed your single linear objective. They couldn't create 6 stages, so they created 6 objectives. Now obviously, a lot of them did require a lot of traversal and a lot of searching, but this was their first title. I think I mentioned this during my Mario 64 retrospective, but I actually think that the Bowser stages is what they would have wanted back then for a 3D Mario. A single linear path start to end, some collectibles and enemies along your way, and plenty of bottomless pits. But they knew the hardware limitations, and they knew that we as a gaming society were probably not ready for that yet. This all evolved in Sunshine. From the collectible side of things, the episodes were a lot more streamlined, a lot more focused. Outside of Delfino Plaza and the Blue Coin Hunt, you barely did any searching in that game. Again, instead of creating multiple stages, they used a single stage with multiple episodes, each one representing a single linear route. I believe it's what their intention was with Mario 64, and that's why they buttoned it up when they got to Sunshine. But I still think they wanted to have that linear stage. That dangerous long hallway with no walls and plenty of bottomless pits. That truly proper evolution from 2D to 3D platforming challenge. That's why I view the Secret Area Shines as the spiritual successors to the Bowser stages. They were still experimenting, but they were getting closer. And I think the biggest issue they had with this was just how difficult it was. Controlling your momentum and your landing in a 3D space is just so much harder than in a 2D space. You're not just fighting the challenge, you're fighting your depth perception. So while they were able to create these linear challenges in Mario Sunshine, which need I remind you on a first time playthrough probably takes about half of your full playtime, just because of how often you lose a life and start over, but their difficulty was so absurd that they had to figure out a way to tweak it. Now obviously, the primary reason these things are so difficult is because of all of the pits. In theory, you could remove bottomless pits altogether. You could even create giant landscapes for you to traverse. But at that point, you're kind of doing the same thing you did in the previous games. The collectathon approach, if you will. The other option is to change the gravity. What if instead of being forced to remain on top of a platform, you can walk on the sides of it or even underneath it? What if instead of making the primary focus jumping over long gaps, they instead make the primary focus the linear traversal, with enemies and puzzles slowing you down along your route, and of course still providing you with fun platforming challenges. This is a 3D platformer after all. But in this case, if you miss a jump, you don't fall to your demise. Gravity pulls you back in and you can continue on exactly where you were. It's funny because in Mario Sunshine, and especially in Mario 64, I've always heard people complain that it feels like so many things are just floating in space, so many platforms are just in space, so many challenges are just in space. So in Galaxy, they literally took everything to outer space. Now they didn't need to build as many massive levels. They could get away with a handful of them and use broken up segments of platforms spread throughout and disguise them as objects in outer space. And that would also allow them to manipulate the gravity. You'll still have your platforming challenges with black holes all throughout, but they'll be in much more focused moments. Outside of those moments, the challenge isn't the platforming, it's the traversal, the advancement, the puzzle solving. It's pretty straightforward, but it's a fun part of the adventure. I think this is what the foundation of Mario Galaxy was. And the final product we got is how much they were able to build off of that foundation. Eventually, we'd get to 3D Land and 3D World. The vision would be actualized. But I think Galaxy was one of the best strides that Nintendo had taken to make it ultimately to 3D World. All of this is to say is that I don't think Mario Galaxy is really that different than Mario 64 and Mario Sunshine. I think in the same way Sunshine took what Mario 64 was doing and hyper-focused you towards an objective, Galaxy took it a step further and focused you even harder on it. And they were largely able to accomplish that with linear stages. Linear stages, I might add, that did not drive you absolutely mad. I think there's a very clear evolution in philosophy from Mario 64 to Galaxy. And again, Galaxy is not the end goal. I think 3D World was. Genuinely, I don't think Nintendo had any intention for collectathons to be as big as they were. Otherwise, they never would have waited for Mario Odyssey to fully bring it back. If they had it their way, 3D World would have been the transition from 2D to 3D. But instead, we had to take a bunch of baby steps to get there. It might be a bit harder to see the similarities between 3D World and Sunshine, but Galaxy is the bridge. I can see the comparison to the games that came before, as well as the comparisons to the games that came after. And honestly, I think that's part of the reason this game is so loved. It's in that awkward middle ground between people that grew up with Mario 64 and people that grew up with Mario 3D World, and it manages to appeal to them both. Galaxy might have the single greatest legacy of the entire 3D Mario franchise. I don't have any weird gimmicks I'm going to tally on this one. There aren't many moments that would frustrate me like in Sunshine, nor are there any random broken elements like Luigi's backflip, but I am going to give this one an honest take. I'm not here to analyze the spectacle, nor am I going to get wowed by the gravity. I'm here to analyze the stages, the challenges, the gimmicks, and the puzzles. When I resurface from this deep dive, I want to be able to highlight why Galaxy is more than just a gravity gimmick. Because I genuinely think there's a lot more brilliance in this game that nobody discusses. But we'll have to make strides to get there. And our first major stop is at Good Egg Galaxy.